Good evening. Good evening, and thank you very much for coming. I want to welcome everyone to our Visionary Conversation session this evening. And to begin with, I'd like to thank the University of Manitoba Alumni Association for their generous sponsorship of our refreshments at this and all Visionary Conversations. This is a new and very exciting series for the University of Manitoba this year. This is our 6th Visionary Conversation in the series held here at the university, but we've had 3 others as a bit of a roadshow done for alumni in Victoria and Vancouver and Calgary, and they've been equally popular there. So if you want to follow tonight's conversation on Twitter, of course, paying attention the whole time, the hashtag is #UMV in uppercase and then Visionary. So it looks like UM Visionary, first 3 letters in uppercase. Visionary Conversations bring together some of the leading minds at the University of Manitoba for a dialogue with the broader community. The university is the home of trailblazers and visionaries and innovators and pioneers, mavericks, defenders, explorers. Our theme for the evening today is gender equality, fact or fiction, a discussion about what's changed for women, who has benefited from feminism, and what lies ahead. The trailblazers who are here this evening represent the area from our strategic planning framework related to human rights and the university's leadership and expertise in this area. So to remind you who've been here before, or for those of you who are new, just to let me tell you a little bit about the format. Each of my colleagues will speak for 5 to 7 minutes to comment on the theme. So they'll be using some visual images that will be on the overhead screens behind us. And then after each of them has spoken, we'll have a discussion and want it to be a conversation between you and the audience and the members of the panel. Look to you to make comments and ask questions. A couple of colleagues will be moving about with wireless microphones, so when we get to the question and discussion period, if you can just indicate your interest in participation, someone will come to you. And since we've advertised the session to end at 8:30, just before that, I'll terminate the conversation part and invite Dr. Deborah, the Vice President, Research and International, to provide a short summation of the key points. So let's move to the business of the evening. It's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker from the panel tonight, Dr. Kelley Beaverford, who is an Associate Professor of Interior Design in the Faculty of Architecture. In addition to her research and teaching responsibilities, she's also the founder and director of Architects Without Borders Canada, an organization focused on creating socially empowering environments. Kelley's work investigates cross-cultural design with an emphasis on design for the other 90%. She holds a Bachelor of Interior Design from the University of Manitoba and a Master's of Architecture from the University of Calgary. Please welcome Kelley Beaverford.
Good evening. I'm going to open tonight's discussion with an overview of gender equality based on lessons that I've learned from working overseas with low-income communities and with students from the University of Manitoba. I teach a course called Service Learning in the Global Community. It has been designed for students from the Faculty of Architecture who are interested in increasing international competencies and knowledge. In a month-long course, students and faculty live and work with a community while addressing a need that has been locally identified. Students serve as apprentices and junior designers on a construction site. They also become temporary members or temporary citizens of a community, adopting a window into a social reality other than their own. I've observed that there are general themes that tend to resonate with students throughout the course. These topics include, but are not limited to, cultural differences and the impact that this has on the built environment, sustainability from an international perspective, and without question, the role of gender and other forms of equality in community development. The students' observations are informed by experiential learning, in addition to readings in things like development, cross-cultural competencies, international knowledge, and so on. The Millennium Development Goals, adopted by the international community in 2000, have also been a great source of discussion amongst the participants. both meaning, when I say participants, I mean both the faculty, the students, and our local partners. These goals set targets for 2015 on eradicating extreme poverty, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating AIDS and other diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability, and providing financing for development. Note that all 8 of these goals touch essential aspects of women's well-being, and in turn, women's empowerment is critical for achieving these goals. This point has been observed by students, it's been observed by economists and experts in the field, as well as by the United Nations. What I'm going to do is show you a few examples of the work that we've done and try to give you an idea of what we've learned and how these things are related. The goals, equality, and the work that we do in communities. In Turkey, we learned from village leaders, at that time mostly men in their mid-30s, that there was a need for community space where women could be part of the informal and formal discussions on political, social, and cultural development of their community, as well as benefit from the results. This project was the first tea house open to women in the history of a 400-year-old village. It was opened in 2007. Gender equality was also on the minds of our partners in Kitebo, Uganda in 2008. Home to many grandmothers who care for 10 to 15 children orphaned by AIDS, the local partners wanted a primary school library that also could easily be converted into a clinic and space for women to meet. We learned from these strong, overworked, and often grieving local women that equality may sometimes require new approaches due to different life conditions or compensation for past discrimination and events, such as pandemics. In this case, the local women need support in terms of access to safe drinking water, education, and health care. In 2011, we worked directly with a women's group in Sri Lanka. The women provided initiative, labor, management, and materials to build a community center and shrine. By working alongside these women, the students and I became aware of the demands on men to sometimes be away from their families for long periods of time in order to raise money to support their families, but also on the demands on women to juggle their roles as mothers, wives, leaders, students, decision makers, and farmers, especially in areas of the world that have been affected by war and natural disasters. In this slide, in the center, I guess on the right, is one of our students talking to the community leader, Damika, who became the hero to all of our students when they realized just how hard she's working. This is the Buddhist shrine that we built with the community in the community center. The last project that I would like to mention is in Ghana, where we worked on a boarding house for girls. Although there has been significant progress in primary education since 2000, the gender gap in education persists. The girls at St. Anne's boarding house come from remote communities where barriers to education may include lack of private girls' sanitation facilities, sexual harassment or violence at school or en route to school, high domestic workloads, and also a need for curriculum reform and teacher training with a greater emphasis on the needs of girls. We worked on a boarding house dining hall and study hall for 75 girls. Now, I could talk more about this project. I mean, to me, they all are involved in the struggle to achieve equity in communities. However, this one focused on education. I think education is especially important because it's a thread that pulls all of the development goals together. And instead of me talking about it, I thought I would share a short clip of our partners talking about it. These women, Gabriella and Veronica, are both headmistresses and teachers in Damongo, Uganda. Thank you.
Your students are good workers? Yes. All of them? Girls' education is very, very important, especially in this rural setup that we are in. Because if you educate a girl or a woman, you educate so many. Not only because the woman will raise a family, will take care of the children, she will be abreast with what to do health-wise, economically, she will know what to do to support the family. And so it's tremendous help for a family if the woman is educated.
I must say that I'm now the pillar of the family because of the education. I take the salary, I share with my family, my father, my mother, I clothe them. As at now, I am struggling as much as possible to even get a building for them to stay in before they die. With my little salary, I have to get them something, and I'm struggling hard with my children too. I have now married, and I have 4 children with twins. Yes, and I'm managing with my children, and I have to take care of the family because as a lady, I am the only highly educated person, and I have to manage with the salary at least to please the family. Yeah, even though there was a boy, another brother of mine, who is also educated, but as a boy, he did not have the concern for the family as I have. So in actual fact, a lady being educated in Ghana, it is something very, very great because you have the concern for the family and even the whole society as a whole.
In conclusion, through my work with students and communities in various parts of the world, I've learned that there's a formidable connection between equality on any grounds, be it gender, class, race, or ethnicity, in the betterment of our global community. I've also learned that achieving equality, including gender equality, is still very much a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelley. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Sherri Farrell Racette, who is an Associate Professor of Native Studies and Women and Gender Studies in the Faculty of Arts. She's an interdisciplinary scholar with an active arts and curatorial practice. Her research interests include Aboriginal women's history, Indigenous art, and knowledge systems. Sherri was born in Manitoba. She's a member of the Temiskaming First Nation in Western Quebec. In 2009-10, she was the Anne Ray Fellow at the School for Advanced Research on the Human Experience in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Sherri?
I think, yeah, does it work? Yeah, it's working. Amazing technology. Well, it's amazing that I'm up here with no images. As an artist, I usually have images, but and also, I think I'm going to apologize in advance for what is going to seem like a combination between a rant or being, as my daughter says, Debbie Downer. But any discussion of equity regarding Métis, First Nations, or Inuit women in Canada must be placed within the larger context of community and history. Our collective inequity is intrinsically tied to structural inequity with roots in our colonial history and a legacy of policy making that accumulates until the present day. Within that, most Canadians are not aware of a series of legislative acts which criminalized our traditions, our language, our ceremonies, our right to raise and educate our own children, travel freely, made fundraising for legal challenges also against the law, banned traditional governments, many of which who privileged traditional women's roles, hereditary government. Yes, basically Indian agents on First Nations reserves and in Inuit communities who were governed by the Indian Act in a Supreme Court decision in the 1930s, Indian agents had the right or the same role as magistrates and justices of the peace so that they could enforce the Indian Act and bring charges against people. A colleague of mine is working on a film for families who resisted residential school, and she's been looking at the RCMP records of charges laid against First Nations people in the early 20th century, and almost all of those early criminal charges were related to ceremonial practice and refusing to send their children to residential school. So this is our history. On Valentine's Day this past February, I joined a group of 300 school children on Parliament Hill, and they sang with my daughter a song she wrote inspired by Cindy Blackstock's I'm a Witness campaign, which addresses inequities in funding support to First Nations children on reserve. School children from Gatineau and Ottawa stood beside children from Gitzigan-Zibi and Golden Lake and read letters asking why First Nations children did not have the same quality of education or level of support that they enjoyed. Why, they asked. People don't realize that educational funding for a child attending a First Nations school is $8,000 less per year than a provincial school would receive for that same child. The inequities in social services and medical support are even more profound. This week, the National Aboriginal Health Organization had its funding cut. Why? Are we suddenly not beset with diabetes, heart disease, and mysterious illnesses that led to this recent post and exchange on a friend's Facebook page? Why are our people so ill up north? Why is there an epidemic of renal heart failure? There is something more insidious going on than poor diet and a change of lifestyle. There is poison in our mother's veins, and we drink from it, shower in it, marinate ourselves in it. And among the comments that followed, there were some independent studies done, and we found out there were high levels of uranium in our water system, including the rain and snow. Unfortunately, our studies were quickly aborted by officials. These conditions affect every woman, man, and child in the community. A focus on women and equity often presumes that men have equity. One time, as a younger woman, a group of us were complaining, as we sometimes do, about men. And in attendance was Maria Campbell, Métis author and sister colleague, and she took a moment and shared a little story that she had been told by an elder. The elder had compared our communities to a herd of buffalo or muskox under attack, with the females, elders, and children in the center, while the males formed the protective outer circle. This, she said, is why so many of our men are more damaged than we are. This is why we, as women, are more whole in our communities, because they historically protected us. Now often they lash out at us in their pain. In an institution like this university, the majority of Aboriginal students are women. They have important needs. They need to be honored as young mothers with often overwhelming responsibilities. Just this past semester, I mean, it's not uncommon to have students that have 5 children, 3 children, who are busing from the north end with inadequate health care. Just in the last year and a half that I've been here, homeless students, hungry students, and students who are trying to provide a better life for their children because many of them are single parents. They need to be honored as young mothers with overwhelming responsibilities, and they need and deserve safe homes and neighborhoods, but they at least are here, and they form the majority of the student body. Gender equity at the university must also consider the needs of men. And last year, I had a beautiful young man in my class, and I felt, as someone described to me once, who had been trying to save someone who'd broken through the ice, and as they had that person by the hand, they said it felt like another person was pulling on that individual, and they actually couldn't hold on to them, and that person was taken away by the water. That's how I felt with this young man in my classroom, that something was pulling him away while those of us at the university were trying to pull him in. I don't know where he is now. I was asking someone if they'd seen him. When a friend of mine adopted an infant several years ago, the child was categorized as a special adoption in the same way that children with severe physical and mental challenges were labeled. And what was his challenge? His challenge was that he was born an Aboriginal male. And according to social services, that tiny baby was already constructed as a societal problem. A fundamental strategy of colonialism historically was to emasculate men and take the women. Women's bodies, I think, and many of us talk about it, are somehow in a colonial mind equated with the land. Possession of a woman's body somehow gives possession to the territory and the land. And today, Canada has one of the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the world, which has, gathered us the attention of the United Nations and Amnesty International. So there we are, Guatemala, Juarez, Mexico, and Canada. And many of, and it's at a critical, almost daily occurrence in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and other Western provinces. 2 weekends ago, we lost 2 young people. A young man who was shot and bled to death and then was constructed by the media as probably a gang member, although his family protested and offered all kinds of other, but it was so important to construct him that way. Similarly, a young woman whose aunt attends this university. So these events aren't happening to some community out there somewhere else. It affects our colleagues, it affects our student body. These incidents, these community realities are part of our reality here too at the university. Our systemic challenges as Indigenous women are often overwhelming, but they are also tied to complex root issues that connect us back to the larger community. Our dark side is splashed all over the media, but it is also linked to the broader Canadian public's dark side. For every 12-year-old prostitute on a street corner in Winnipeg, there's a lineup of customers. Our dark side is connected to your dark side. Equity for us as women, but also as men and children, our equity must begin with our children. It must begin, first of all, with rehumanizing our dehumanized image. And it must start with safety. It was interesting that just before I came here, I went on Facebook to find the quote that I had read earlier. And while I was writing this and I was getting my notes together, a little ding came up on my Facebook page, and it was a former student of mine who I taught in Saskatchewan. It must have been 15 years ago. And he's now in grad school. And he said, I want to ask you something. What do you want to see? And because he's Ho-Chunk, he's living in the States now, I said, things are overwhelming up here right now. We need safety. And we need something for the men. To which he replied something really cheeky. And I said, and he said something, we need to sort of emasculate or he had something like that. And I said, no, keep the spirit. We have to keep the spirit. So many of the strategies that have been implemented with, and well, not often with, very often to Aboriginal people or for Aboriginal people, have focused on somehow changing us. And we don't want to change. We want to be safe, we want to be stronger, we want to be better. And we need to start with support, deconstructing that interrelated network of economic, social, and legal factors, which basically have led us to this place. I'm not hopeless, though, with little exchanges like I had with my former student, but also, as Cindy Blackstock said when she saw those children singing together, she said, this is the true spirit of reconciliation, in the spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to see those children asking why their First Nations brothers and sisters didn't have the same library service that they did. She said, this is reconciliation in action. So there's potential, but we have many challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherri. Deborah Parks is an associate professor of law. Pardon? Here at the University of Manitoba. She's editor of the Canadian Journal of Women and the Law. She researches and teaches in criminal and constitutional law with a particular focus on equality rights and prisoners' rights. She holds a multi-year grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to investigate oversight and accountability of imprisonment in Canada and internationally. Professor Parks.
Well, thank you very much, and what a pleasure to be here with these other really visionary speakers. The panel discussion today poses the question, gender equality, fact or fiction? And I would say that for women in the criminal justice system in Canada, gender equality is a fiction. Why do I say that? Well, in my 5 minutes. First, you're probably aware that men vastly outnumber women in prison. Women are under 10% of the provincial shorter-term jail population, and around 5% of the longer-term federal, those in federal custody. In addition, as a group, women's crimes tend to be, again, as a generalization, on the lower end of seriousness. Approximately half are property crimes, and women's violent offenses are more likely to be common assault or simple assault rather than more serious offenses, although, of course, there are cases where women commit serious violent offenses. Yet at the end of the day, women do harder time. They tend to pay a higher price for crime than men do. And again, none of this is to suggest that that women or that men who are in jail have it easy by any stretch. But both formally and in terms of more harsh conditions of confinement, being incarcerated a longer distance from families, and in terms of impact on them as mothers, and in many cases primary caregivers for children. And I should also say that women are not a monolithic group. Indigenous women in particular, I argue, pay an even higher price. They are much more likely than other women in the system to be designated as maximum security, serving time in max, more likely to be in solitary confinement, more likely to be denied parole and to serve their full sentence. In addition, the vast majority of women prisoners have been victimized by crime themselves. 86% of women prisoners report histories of physical abuse, 68% have experienced sexual abuse, and almost 1/3 of women admitted to federal prisons in 2009 presented with mental health issues, and significant ones. Many women with mental health issues serve their time in solitary confinement, like this woman, Ashley Smith, who after many years in extreme conditions of solitary confinement eventually died by putting a ligature around her neck while a number of guards watched her every move on surveillance cameras. Ultimately, there is an irony and a great injustice in the reality that smaller numbers of women prisoners means harder time. Why and how is this so? Well, there are many complex reasons, and particularly for Indigenous women, what Sherri has just talked about are major contributing factors to their situation and the hard time that they do. But at a basic level, there's economies of scale. A man who is sentenced to federal time in Canada, even maximum security, will generally serve his time in a large institution, usually quite near to where he lives, where he can move through the facility. Again, no picnic. It's not club fed for the most part. On the other hand, a woman sentenced to federal time will often be hundreds or thousands of miles away, and if in maximum security, will be in a very small unit, which is tantamount to solitary confinement in many cases. There are no real minimum security women's prisons in Canada. Due to, again, the smaller numbers, all women's prisons are so-called multi-level institutions to deal with all security classifications, meaning that minimum security women do their time in effective medium security. So, what does equality mean? What does gender equality mean in this context? Certainly, the concept of formal equality, or seeking the same conditions, services, and programs that men receive, is not the answer. For a couple of reasons. One, it's not working particularly well for men, as it's not a model to be aspired to, but beyond that, women do tend to have different needs and circumstances which do not fit the traditional correctional approach, which is aimed at men. Again, not to suggest that it's a model. Canadian law has explicitly adopted a concept of substantive equality, which means that true equality often requires treating groups differently. Attempts at implementing such an approach have been made in the Canadian context. In the early 1990s, there was much optimism around the release of a groundbreaking National Task Force report on federal women's corrections called Creating Choices, which calls for a new approach to addressing the needs of women prisoners on the basis of research for many years, indicating that women generally were high needs, low risk, as compared again, to men as a group. The Canadian government was urged to abandon the traditional coercive regime in favor of smaller institutions with independent living units, no perimeter fences, dynamic security, meaning more staffing, less fences, bars, and cameras, to have mother and child units and programming led and delivered by the local community. Fast forward to 2012. The old prison for women in Kingston, which used to be the only women's federal prison in Canada, has long closed. Newer prisons, like the one pictured here, and the new provincial women's jail built here in Manitoba, have been opened. However, the situation for women prisoners is arguably worse than it ever was before many of the reforms. Federal and provincial governments have spent millions on the bricks and mortar of new facilities, but virtually nothing on the development of community services and programs. And I say, and I'm being provocative here, but the disparity in terms of the amount spent on community services programs is really significant. Combined with other societal changes, decreased funding to social programs that have a particular negative impact on women, a more punitive law and order agenda, we are, I argue, simply warehousing women and men, rather than responding to their needs in a way that will make our communities safer. In spite of the evidence that women are, that still persists that women are generally high needs, low risk, they are proportionately the fastest growing prison population worldwide and in Canada. Last fall, the federal prison ombudsperson, Howard Sapers, raised concerns about the growing crisis of overcrowding in women's prisons across the country. Due to the increasing number of women being sentenced to prison, spaces intended for counseling and treatment are increasingly being used as cells despite lacking toilets or running water. Authorities have been forced to place prisoners in trailers and gymnasiums. Accompanying the overcrowding are increased incidents of violence, particularly incidents of self-inflicted injuries, which have more than tripled over the past 2 years. And I've not even got to the question of cost. Imprisoning women is extremely costly. Again, economies of scale. For federally sentenced women, the cost ranges from $160,000 per woman per year to over $300,000. It's truly astounding, and the societal return is, I would argue, very limited and in most cases quite negative. But returning to the question of gender equality, which we started, I would suggest that the failure to implement the ideals of the Creating Choices report was inevitable in light of its underlying raison d'etre, namely to create a new, better system of imprisonment, albeit one intended to be more responsive to the needs of women, including particularly the needs of Indigenous women. The idea of a women-centered prison, tasked with empowering women and giving meaningful choices, was, I would argue, a paradox from the start. Prisons are fundamentally not empowering places. They are about punishment. So for me and for many others who research and work on the ground with women in the criminal justice system, the answer is not bigger and better prisons. That experiment has failed. The former Supreme Court of Canada Justice Louise Arbour, in her 1996 report into women's imprisonment that was prompted by serious human rights abuses at the prison for women, said that the relatively low number of women convicted of crime relative to men, combined with the relatively low risk they pose to the community, should be seen as an opportunity to pilot new community-based programs and initiatives rather than an excuse to ignore their situation. So I'll end there and hope that we can take some of this in the discussion period. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Our last speaker tonight is Karen Busby, who is a professor of law and the academic director of the University of Manitoba's Human Rights Research Initiative. She leads projects designed to connect the University of Manitoba with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Her research focuses on the discriminatory aspects of law regulating sexuality, sexual violence, obscenity, prostitution, sexual orientation, and human reproduction. She was introduced into the Canadian Q Hall of Fame in 2011. Karen.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight and to see all of you out there. So let's start with the fact. In the last 40 years, many women's lives have been transformed through the work of the feminist movement. We don't want to lose sight of that. Yet, by most, by most social economic indicators, girls and women in Canada are relatively disadvantaged in comparison to men and boys. Women who are Indigenous, disabled women, racialized women, or lesbian still live with greater inequality when compared to other women in Canada. And if we look at the situation of women in most non-Western countries, it's a complete fiction to say they have achieved any measure of gender inequality. So I'm going to use my time tonight to present some facts and some figures about violence, about work and wages, and about reproduction. So let's start with violence. More men than women are victims of physical violence than women. But I speak of violence as a gendered issue for two reasons. First of all, overwhelmingly, men are the perpetrators of violence, whether it's against men or against women. And secondly, almost all violence against women occurs because they are women. In other words, it's sexualized or intimate violence or violence that's motivated by gender nonconformity with religious dictates. There's so much I could say about domestic and sexual violence, but I'm going to focus on some of the work that I've done recently in these two areas. I've just finished a paper on spousal sexual assault, and one of the particular focuses I had in that paper was on strangulation. Non-lethal strangulation has historically only rarely been prosecuted, in part because victims minimize the violence, but more importantly, because police, prosecutors, and judges fail to recognize that it occurred, and they also fail to recognize that it's a strong precursor of lethal violence. My research reveals that strangulation is still not taken seriously in the criminal justice system unless it results in death. The second thing that my recent research on spousal sexual assault showed is that sexual history evidence, which is presumptively inadmissible in sexual assault cases and has been inadmissible since 1983, is used in almost every single spousal sexual assault case. So let me say that again. You think past sexual history can't be used in sexual assault cases in Canada? That's simply not true when it comes to spousal sexual assault. It's admitted often without an application being made, and when an application is made to admit it, it goes in. I also want to talk a little bit about stranger or near stranger sexual assault. You may remember the Rhodes case, which was in the news so much early last year. Professor Parks and I both worked on the intervention in this case before the Manitoba Court of Appeal by LEAF, the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. In Rhodes, the trial judge found that a young Indigenous woman living in Thompson was sexually assaulted by a man who she had met 20 minutes earlier outside a bar. However, the judge felt that a lenient sentence was appropriate in this case because the defendant was merely a clumsy Don Juan. He implied that she was partly to blame for what happened because, as he said it, sex was in the air, and she was wearing high heels, lipstick, and a tube top. Now, what's interesting to try to figure out is the discriminatory thinking in the Rhodes case isolated, or is it pervasive in the criminal justice system? While Deborah and I were working on the Rhodes intervention, we found some very troubling Statistics Canada data which demonstrated that when compared to other violent crimes, sexual assault in Canada, but especially in Manitoba, is underreported, undercharged, under-prosecuted, and under-sentenced. Finally, I want to just very briefly touch on the gendered nature of human trafficking. First of all, I want to mention that because of severe cutbacks to research budgets, and given its clandestine nature, it's very hard to get reliable statistics on the numbers of trafficked women and men. But estimates worldwide suggest that between 700,000 and 2 million people every year are trafficked across national borders. If intra-country trafficking is included, up to 4 million people are trafficked every year. And remember, trafficking is tantamount to slavery. So 4 million people are trafficked every single year around the world. Trafficking is very much a gendered phenomena. It's estimated that at least 2/3 of trafficked people are women, and by conservative estimates that 73% of those who have been trafficked are in forced prostitution or in domestic servitude. Human trafficking is, of course, illegal, but it's hard to prosecute. In 2009 in Canada, there were 5 trafficking convictions, and that was a new high. In previous years, there had been at best 1 or 2 trafficking convictions in Canada. And I have to say that the current federal government has made a lot of political noise about doing something about human trafficking, but the only concrete thing that they have done is to raise mandatory minimum penalties for trafficking. And it's interesting to note that women who are trafficked into Canada are returned to their home country. They're not allowed to stay here unless they are successful in making a humanitarian and compassionate application, which often isn't a successful application for them to make. Let's change our focus now and just look for a few minutes at work and wages. I should start by saying that more women are in university and college programs than men. Women students achieved parity in about 1992, and their numbers have been increasing ever since then. However, far more men than women are in apprentice traineeship programs. But has this educational advantage, which has now been around for a generation, which has now been around for more than 20 years, has it translated into better wages for women? The answer is no. You can see that the gender wage gap has hardly changed in the last 30 years, and in fact it regressed slightly between 1998 and 2008. At this rate, women will achieve wage parity with men in another 170 years. But let's flip the coin over and ask, are men more involved in unpaid domestic labor? And here you can see the answer is yes, but women still do far more housework and childcare and home maintenance than men do. And what about ambitious women? Well, they or we still knock the glass ceiling. Women are nowhere near equal numbers on corporate governing boards, as partners in professional practice, in elected office, or in the professoriate. Here at University of Manitoba, among older professors, you would of course expect to see more men than women, given historic hiring patterns. But has that number dropped with more attention to gender parity in recent years? And here the answer is no. If you look at the number of people who have a professorial rank, either a tenure track or a tenure position in Manitoba, there are about 40% more men than women under the age of 40 who currently hold tenure track positions or tenured positions. So while the number of women in the professoriate is increasing, it's increasing at a snail's pace. Finally, I want to talk just for a minute about reproductive rights. So do women enjoy reproductive freedom? And the answer to this question depends very much on who you are and where you live. Here are just some quick facts. This chart shows the skewed sex ratios in China over the last 20 years and clearly demonstrates a preference for male children. By 2020, China and India will, respectively, have 35 million and 25 million more men than women. South Korea, Nepal, Vietnam, and Taiwan also have significantly skewed sex ratios. And what about another important indicator, that of maternal mortality rates? We can see from this chart that we can reduce maternal mortality to a very small figure. But we can also see a worrisome increase in maternal mortality rates in both Canada and the United States. And we can see that in some countries, the sky-high maternal mortality rates are simply beyond comprehension. Finally, I would mention that still today, African American women have a very significantly increased risk of maternal mortality over other women in the United States. And the limited data that we have in Canada indicates that Indigenous women are nearly twice the risk of maternal mortality compared to the rest of the Canadian population. So that's all I'm going to say for now. My time's up, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Karen. So, folks, this is indeed intended to be a conversation, and all of the panelists have made many points that I'm sure are of interest and that will provoke response. So, again, I'll remind you, if you have questions or comments, please indicate by raising your hand, and one of my colleagues with one of the microphones will find you. So, up at the back, Chris.
I appreciate, is it Karen, the last speaker, bringing some sliver of positive news, I guess, to this talk. That said, I would suggest that your stats went back to 1996. I think I saw one stat that went back to 1990. I'm disappointed. I consider myself a liberal human. I'm disappointed that no one talked about the progress we made in every regard, whether it be somewhere else in the world or Aboriginal women, and in particular what goes on between the people who are here and in relationships. And if we went back to 1950 and we all sat in a 1950 environment compared to now, we've made a great, I would suggest, we've made a great deal of progress in Canada and around the world, notwithstanding the stats and the material you brought to our attention, which is horrific. So I'm disappointed about the lack of positive growth that was not acknowledged over the course of time, because Dr. Racette talked about something from the 1930s. We've made progress, and I'm sorry you haven't made that comment.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yes, that wasn't a question, sorry.
Right.
I don't mind responding. I was kind of expecting someone to ask because I brought up the Millennium Development Goals, and they were established in 2000 with goals set for 2015. So I looked at the recent statistics just to see how we're doing, the world's doing. There has been a decline of extreme poverty, so that's good. Better access to water, both of these things directly affect women, so also ties into equity. Progress in combating TB and malaria, so health and hygiene increase. Better gender parity in primary school education, and so that's a very important part in achieving equity. And also the challenges the United Nations feels, like all of these things should be celebrated because they are great things that have happened since 2000. However, the challenges are that there are still great disparities between countries and within regions. So I would say internationally things are getting better, but there's still obviously things to do.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Stand here.
This is to the president of the university. In view of what you've heard tonight, that 40% of the people under the age of 40 who are becoming professors and tenured are male. Like there's much more, Professor Busby, you have those statistics. There's more tendency for men to be tenured professors. Are you going to make any commitment? Are you going to do any work towards achieving parity in view of the fact that women are making commitments to careers and also they're getting more educated than men are?
I'll help you
Thank you.
just for a second here, and then he still has to answer the question. There's statistics on the University of Manitoba website that talk about what is the ratio, the gender ratio for various age groups in the professoriate, and by professoriate I mean those who are tenure tracked or tenured. And of those under 40, which is pretty much anybody hired in the last 10 years, but it's by age, those under 40 at the university in those ranks, 97 men are under 40 and 68 women are under 40. So that's a 40% difference between men and women. So that suggests, in hiring in the last decade. So we don't actually, I don't have the figures on who was hired, but who's under 40, we have 40% more men under 40 than women. So that suggests going forward that it's going to be a long time before, like the next generation of leaders for this university, we still have that inequity going forward. I was shocked actually to see those figures on the University of Manitoba website.
So I agree that those figures are shocking. I think the university in general is committed to dealing with applicants equitably, and the particular pattern of what happens depends on where there are positions and from where people are applying. But I must confess I don't understand the discrepancy of that magnitude in the past decade. So I think we've got a number of programs in place, clearly not enough. So I can't answer specifically what we'll do now, but we'll certainly be paying attention to it as we move forward.
I just wanted to respond to the speaker here. I think you're right that we need to celebrate the advances that we have made, and there are many. I particularly note this when I speak with young women today who don't realize the advances that the women's movement made years ago. And I think we need to do a better job of celebrating that and focusing on that. But I guess one of the reasons that, evenings like tonight that we spend time, maybe perhaps overly focusing on what we haven't done is because, we really haven't, in so many areas, made the advances that I think we have a right to expect. You saw Professor Busby's statistics on women's mortality rates. We talk about the numbers of people that are entering post-secondary education, Aboriginal people, for example. And, we talk about the statistics of the numbers of people that are entering. And if I could just focus on the Aboriginal point for a moment, we talk about numbers of students. Isn't it great that we've got 20% of our student population is now Aboriginal? But what we fail to recognize is that the majority of those 20% have been assimilated into our Western mainstream post-secondary system. We haven't changed our mainstream system to make space for Aboriginal worldview. We've simply done a better job of assimilating them, getting them in the door. So I think we have to look carefully at the kinds of advances or perceived advances. And so on the one hand, you're quite correct. We've made some amazing progress. But on another, the other side of the coin, I guess, is for me, is that I'm a little leery of some of the things that we call successes. And I think we have so much more to do on so many fronts that it's disappointing that this is 2012 and we're still dealing with some of the statistics that have been raised here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a really important point. And I also think that it's important to recognize that while we have made these advances in a number of the indicators, especially the international indicators dealing with the MDGs, have improved, but we've also, I think it's really important to recognize that there has been significant retrenchment in a lot of these areas, and especially dealing with areas of gender equity and also just general social equality. And if we don't recognize that this retrenchment, especially the last sort of 10 to 15 years, was sort of, largely in a neoliberal era, then we can't make any more advances. We won't move forward.
I'd just like to make a comment, and I know that, like in regards to the one what date that I said it was 1930, but I think it's important when we look at the level of social chaos that we have in our communities, and I'm just being honest, we have a high level of social chaos in our communities, that these are not situations that are easily unpacked and resolved, and that it also didn't end back then. You look at the Indian Act didn't get changed until 1951. We didn't have the vote until 1960. We have never had equitable resource sharing, so that you have communities sitting on top of diamond mines where all the resources are going into the provincial government of Ontario, and the community doesn't even have a school. And also the retrenchment. That's a really critical issue that there were gains made. Like when I think of where I spent a great deal of my career, which was at the Gabriel Dumont Institute, which was a major move forward in Saskatchewan, where there were a number of programs in education which were created in 1 year. In 1 year we had an alternate high school, we had an Aboriginal teacher education program that was put in place, we had an entire post-secondary institution that was put in place in 1980. And it was a major move forward, and it made a big difference. We had funding for students, we had money for student bursaries, and slowly over the years, all of that has been, or much of that has been pulled back, so that we aren't able to attract the same number of students. When people say we have this percentage of Aboriginal students, I would ask again the sort of, I suppose, the critical question: how many are graduating? What's your attrition rate? What kind of supports are we doing, and what are we helping to bridge? We need to be doing more to bridge the students that are falling through the cracks. And the profound inequities for children has clearly, which is current, which is happening now, has profound impacts on those kids grown up. I have a friend who's teaching high school. I'm like, I'll get them next year. You know, I get them at, you know, you teach them at 17, I might, if I'm lucky, get them at 19. But people have this idea. I think that we need to be very careful about the myth of progress. And we need to really fight. I mean, I know I have the same conversations with one of my daughters who was complaining about something. And I said to her, hey, don't knock it, we're one generation off the road allowance. Because literally, her dad grew up on the road allowance, was born on the road allowance. We have running water, yay. But that's because we live in a city. You go back to community, the issues are much more challenging. So, I mean, I think we could be celebratory. I'm here, but as someone pointed out, I'm a really good example of the kind of person who can sneak through a system. I'm not that brown. I don't speak an Aboriginal language. I don't have an accent. People think I'm French or Italian, often Portuguese. You know, it's like if you keep your mouth shut and your head down, you can get through the system. But my cousins have not followed me. So I'm still, when I started university, I was the first person in my family to graduate with a grade 12. I've been able to get 4 kids through the system. But my cousins and their children, I'm still, for my branch of the family, we're still the only ones who went to university. Who, you know, it's just, it's not, we've made progress, yes, but we need to really look carefully at not being too celebratory, because we want to bring everybody with us. I have no desire to assimilate particularly. I want a better, I need my home community to be healthy and strong, because that's where the culture is strong. I need to be able to go home. I need to be able to connect with that home community. So moving to the city, it might be, you know, it's maybe a personal solution on a very superficial level. But I mean, those are the things that we need to balance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, just a second, because it won't be recorded. Thank you.
I wonder if any of you have ideas of what can be done to educate society about the equality of genders. I feel that in my life, and I'm well past 70, any effort that I've gained in gender equality has been through me personally fighting for my rights and proving that I have something to say. Surely, and I'm not blaming men, I think society is doing this to them. And as I get older, it's even more difficult because I'm dealing with a lot of older guys, right? But I wonder if you can give me some idea what society can do to make it a little easier.
I'm a little worried about that comment about older guys. Perhaps each of the panelists might comment on that.
I guess from a global point of view is, like the course that I'm teaching, I think that's part of the thing. It's just like a small little course and a small effort of forming partnerships and collaborating so that people are seen as actual people, not only statistics. And you know, it's a really exciting course to teach because the students talk a lot about what they've learned and maybe assumptions that they've had growing up in Canada and seeing a completely different social reality. So I think that's one way, building partnerships.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that, and it's a bit in response to the question or comment at the back earlier too, in terms of in the work that I do. I mean, I think the area that I work in, as you know, it's quite depressing, of course, as I think came across a bit in my research. But it's how we deal with crime in our society and how we the increasing attention that we put on imprisonment and the increasing use that we make of imprisonment, I think is a really important reality that Canadians need to understand better. So I'm fortunate to be in a role where I see my role as in relation to the students that I'm teaching. I'm teaching future lawyers, but also in relation to this kind of work that I do, which is a real pleasure to be here, and for you being here to try to open a little bit of a window on, in my case, a really important institution that we use in increasing numbers, and we get really not very good return on the great amount of our taxpayers' money that is going into the punishment system in this country. And it's really very hard to get a window on that at all. And Dr. Barnard mentioned the research that I'm doing on oversight and accountability of imprisonment, trying to actually even get a sense of what is going on behind prison walls. And this is not to suggest that that the people that work in those institutions aren't having really fantastic and great intentions in terms of doing that work. But what is actually going on, and in our name, we often don't know. And I just think it's really important for us to be aware of that, because it's very costly to our society in human and fiscal terms. And so I just take this as an opportunity to try to crack a little bit of a window on that, and for you all to make your own judgments about whether you think that it's working or not, and whether we should be asking different questions and looking for different solutions in terms of how we deal with things.
I have two responses. The first one is, you said that you feel like you did it all on your own, and I very much feel like I stand on the shoulders of giants. And I'm sorry that Muriel Smith's not here tonight, and June Menzies. They've been at most of them, of these critical conversations, and they're responsible for the family law reform in Manitoba, and that was absolutely transformational for women in the 70s, the reforms that took place at that time. But I would take a slightly different tact on, what can happen. And it's a piece I left out of my presentation because I thought I didn't have that much time. But there's a study of British men, of 700 British men who regularly visited prostitutes. And one of the questions that they were asked is, did they ever believe that they had visited a woman who was being trafficked as a prostitute? Had they ever paid for sex with a woman who was trafficked? And they, 1/3 of them said, oh yeah, I've had sex with a trafficked woman. And they said, how did you know that she was a trafficked woman? And they said, well, she couldn't speak English, she felt really vulnerable, she had bruises on her body, or she told me and she asked me to help her. And so, I'm still at a place where I would, because so much of my work is on sexualized violence, to really ask men to take responsibility for what they do and to hold more men accountable for what they do. I frequently have conversations with people where I say, do you know anybody who visits a prostitute? And all women will say, I don't know anybody who visits a prostitute. But men know who visits prostitutes, and they're the ones who are keeping women, in forced sexual servitude. And I'd like men to call more men into account.
Sure.
I think for me, and I think when you say it's a personal struggle, I think for all of us, that's where it kind of, in some respects, begins and ends. Just with our own personal struggle, but also putting our hand out to acknowledge the people who came before us, because we all we all do stand on the shoulders of other people. I think of Mary Tuak's early, who fought for years to get women's status back, for example. Totally, I have my status back as a First Nations woman because of those women that fought throughout the 60s and 70s. And so we do have that responsibility to tell our children about that. As someone who's done a lot of the number of meetings and committees I've been on, like many of you, and many of them with the intention of advocating for change. But for me, my most powerful tool has been my arts practice, because it has a public audience. I think for me, my arts practice, and when I look at filmmakers and theater and music and the kinds of things that affect the soul and the heart of people, that those kinds of things really affect change and can do that rehumanizing work that I mentioned when I was talking. That I think that those are powerful tools, and we perhaps need to maybe think about making better use of them, even for our own healing, because when you're in a struggle, we have to also look after ourselves as we continue that struggle.
If it's not presumptuous, I could just comment from the perspective of the university. I think one of the things that we can do as a community is things like this. If I could just make reference to something that Professor Farrell Racette already mentioned, the the experience of the residential schools has been something that I think has moved people on this campus in a way that is, I don't know, fundamental, shattering really, for a number of reasons and because of a number of public events, teaching opportunities, public lectures. The Dean of Law sitting beside you hosted a display of photographs, and I think many of us were deeply moved by not only the photographs themselves, but the stories that were told by survivors. So I think it's, one of the things the university can do is let the personal experience touch other people, right? And that I think is, so we're thankful that you're all here tonight because that's the purpose of these visionary conversations.
Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say thanks. I really enjoyed hearing all of your thoughts, and so I'm pretty sure this is probably one of my favorite visionary conversations thus far. So I wanted to thank all the speakers and thank Dr. Barnard for organizing this. And one of the things that I found quite interesting that lots of people, or lots of the speakers quite mentioned, was intersectionality. And it's something that I would have actually hoped that you went a bit farther on, and so that's something that I had 2 questions about, and feel free to either comment on either one or both. But one thing that was alluded to in most of your presentations was the idea of racialization or racial identity, and in particular the Canadian context, Indigenous identity, and how that affects conversation about gender equality or equity, which is also used interchangeably, equity and equality. And one thing that I found quite interesting, and maybe I'd ask you to comment on, is if you're talking about crime rates, for example, or imprisonment rates, and the increased criminalization of Indigenous women versus Caucasian women in Canada. Even though the number of women that are imprisoned is low, you still have a high percentage of Indigenous women in prisons. And so how integral do you view both of those struggles, I guess, within the larger conversation on gender equality? And so how important is intersectionality, the inclusion of intersectionality in that gender equality or equity conversation? The second sort of point is something that I felt was quite left out of the conversation is we're sort of splitting everybody down the middle when we're talking about gender equality and we're talking about men and women or males and females, but what about everybody else? And so I'd be interested to see if there is room, because there should be room, and I think that a lot of individuals don't traditionally fall into either a man or woman or male or female role do still face a lot of gender-based violence. And it certainly is a social reality that is poignant in Canada, around the world, and it is an experience that really shouldn't be overlooked. And so how do you include that in a dialogue on gender equality or gender equity? And how would you include that in any of the answers that you already gave? Thank you.
Maybe I'll just quickly try to start on that. We had 5 minutes. So, I can't tell you how many things I put in, took out, and tried to, cover a range of things. And, but I can't speak for everybody on this panel, but I suspect everybody on this panel really tries to work in an intersectional way, in the research that they do, and the way and the activism that they do, and how they approach particular problems. And different people will do it in different ways, with different focus. But for example, the paper I just finished on spousal sexual assault, it was really frustrating because the particular methodology I was using, which was case law review, you actually can find out almost nothing from a case law review about the social economic characteristics of the individuals who are involved. It's erased completely out of the case law. And I know the reviewers are going to come back and say, where is the intersectionality? But the methodology doesn't pull it out. And it's still a worthwhile piece of research to do, but it's really frustrating. But that's also illuminating to say judges erase it completely, from the analysis. But I think it's integral to what we do, and some of us do it better than others. And but I think that certainly it's part of what I do. And in the examples I tried to draw on tonight, I really tried to pull out some of those examples.
Yeah, and really great questions. So thank you for that. So I can say yes, I only had 5 minutes too, but it's true. And you know, for Indigenous women in Canada, the Indigenous women in particular are the fastest growing prison population in Canada. And you know, if you even look at the overrepresentation, everyone always talks about overrepresentation. We throw it out all the time as, you know, just this fact. But it's, you know, the shocking overrepresentation of Indigenous people in our jails is growing, and it's growing faster for women than men. And again, it's not, I don't say that because, you know, I think it's as simple as saying, you know, women are either committing more crimes, women are being convicted of things, we're changing our attitudes about women generally. But Indigenous women are bearing the brunt of the punitive turn in Canada. And there's so many reasons why that is that relate to colonialism and all the work that Sherri has talked about. But we can't, I mean, and so I'm guilty tonight of simply talking about the overrepresentation without getting underneath that. And if you are familiar with this area, you know the work of Patricia Montour, someone that we just lost, well, it's about, is it 2 years ago or a year ago? She was a Mohawk woman, lawyer, professor. She was most recently at University of Saskatchewan. And she and I worked together in, starting about 10 years ago on a human rights action to raise awareness about the treatment of women prisoners, and particularly Indigenous women. And she really challenged me to go beyond talking about the numbers of overrepresentation and trying to get at why that's happening. And she passed away recently, so we've lost her, but I recommend her work to you, and I can talk a little bit more after about some of the ideas that she has and some of us are trying to take up about working with Indigenous women's groups to actually challenge some of the ways that they are criminalized and haven't been involved at all in any of the solutions to that. So, I mean, I could say more later.
I guess just quickly, when you think about international issues, it's equity in all of its forms. And so, like the others too, with only a few minutes to talk about it, I kind of chose to focus more on women's issues, but it's really important in all of its forms.
I think in terms of gay, lesbian, and transgendered folks in our community, it's really, I mean, on the one hand, let's say in the art world, someone like Kent Monkman, with his performance practice, is internationally celebrated. But when it comes down, I actually had a group of friends who were talking about wanting to get together and talk about some of the artistic practices and how that's different. And I said, well, why don't you apply to this place and organize a symposium? And they said, oh, they'd never accept us. They would never accept that proposal. And so the level of discrimination that they felt in terms of openness to funding for them to be able to get together in dialogue as a group of artists and curators about critical issues related to gender and sexuality, I was surprised, actually. So I've been talking and thinking, trying to think about how to facilitate something, because they're outside sort of the system and I'm inside the system. For example, what happens when people move to the city and people, let's say they get AIDS, they can't go back home because the homophobia in their community is so profound. In some cases, it's tradition, which has a, might have, doesn't always have. And on the other hand, it's the profound impact of residential schools and kind of the Christian brainwashing that people received that's caused a kind of erasure or amnesia of what historically in many communities was a much more open attitude towards gender. Because someone just asked me that question. We were looking at a series of graphic novels on Indigenous women's history, and someone said, is there like a gay or bisexual character that we could, is there someone in history that you've come across? And I'm like, yeah, actually. There is. There was a woman chief, and she was married, and she had this, and she pops up in the fur trade records because they were all had this imaginary Amazonian woman, and this very ordinary little woman walked into the fur trade post, and so what gets documented is their disappointment. Because in their imagination they had her some Greek goddess, but yeah, she was quite ordinary. But I think that it is an area of neglect. For example, in Native Studies, there's, I think, one course, because we were just talking about that today. We were just doing a curriculum review.
Thank you.
I was wondering, it was mentioned, I think, once explicitly that I heard, and it certainly is an underlying current, but I mean, it seems to me that one of the issues that is not being talked about enough, not to criticize this panel because they only had a few minutes each, but is class. Outright talking about it as class, and the fact that a great deal of the inequality that we have now is about class, and it's intersected with race, it's intersected with ethnicity, it's intersected with gender, but it's really about class. And if you pull apart the data on women's incomes, if you pull apart the data, as was talked about in terms of university versus, you know, apprenticeships, but it's not just apprenticeships, it's every other kind of non-university education, and particularly non-formal college and university education, where women are far, far behind men, not only in terms of, you know, incomes and so on, but the labor market is still absolutely stratified and segmented by gender and by race and so on. So I'm just wondering, you know, how you see integrating that, and whether you think it's important to integrate it more explicitly. And the other is how? Do you have ideas about how we put this back on the table if you think it needs to be on the table?
The only thing, that's not an area where I particularly do work, but one of the things I had in my gender wage chart originally was averages and means, because I thought maybe somebody would ask about that. And it's interesting that in the first 30 years, 1978 to so 78, 88, and 98, that the average and the mean were almost the same. The mean was a little bit higher, but not that much higher. Where it really changed was in the year where, in the last year, 2008, where women's average wages dropped, but the mean actually rises. And what's really interesting is it actually shows that wealthier men are getting much, much wealthier, that huge disparity is occurring there. So something is happening there, but my own work isn't so much on women and money. I just knew nobody was going to be talking about that in their presentation tonight. And I just find it so shocking that wages have, the wage disparity hasn't shifted, that I just really wanted to make sure that was here tonight. But it's not something I can speak to with any kind of depth.
Certainly, I mean, it's another great question, and it's not particularly insightful to say that if you actually address poverty in this country and infuse money into necessary social programs and all of that, that you're going to actually alleviate the need for imprisonment, at least a significant amount of that. Like, there's a certain amount of crime that it's fairly well known now is related to poverty. There's also certain other kinds of crimes that aren't as related to poverty, that more middle class people will commit and that sort of thing. But I mean, that's for sure. But poverty is, so it's not a matter of, and I don't think this is what you're suggesting, but it's not a matter of saying it's all about class. I think, and the question over here is about intersectionality, interlocking nature of marginalization and disadvantage. And so poverty is racialized in Canada. And so there are important connections to make, so you can't simply talk about poverty. And so, for example, for Indigenous people, some of the other work that I've been doing is around the sentencing of Aboriginal people. And there's an important case from the Supreme Court a number of years ago called Gladue, which says that you're supposed to take into account the circumstances of an Aboriginal person and use imprisonment as a last resort for everyone, but with particular attention to Aboriginal people. And that reform was brought in the mid-1990s out of a recognition of the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people. But to simply treat that as a sort of socioeconomic matter, we're looking at socioeconomic indicators without looking at the history of colonialism and the relationship between those two things, I think is not, doesn't get you the full picture. So, so I think you always have to be asking questions about to what extent are you seeing relationships between these different sort of grounds of oppression, you can call them, and try to unpack why that's happening and not just simply assume it's one or the other.
Thank you. One last question.
I would like to direct my question towards Dr. Beaverford. There were a couple of case studies that you had mentioned, the Turkish case study and the case study in Ghana. And, sorry. Thank you very much. With regards to the Turkish case study, I'm actually wondering, with the establishment of the tea house where the women are able to come and gather and discuss the problems or possible solutions within the community, I'm actually wondering if those women are required to gain permission from men to enter that tea house. Because I know from another course that I have taken, the course had, or the professor rather, had noted that within that Turkish community, women who are a little bit more educated and who would like to actually go out into the society and get jobs need permission from either their husbands or fathers or other male representatives in order to go out and get that job. And the second question I have with regards to the Ghana case study, the second woman who was giving her speech about needing to support her family, and stating that the brothers within her family, even though they also had educations, that they did not feel the compassion to remain within the family to help support it. I'm wondering if that is a pattern that is seen amongst many families with educated women, or was that just one particular study? Thank you.
Okay, those are both good questions. Turkey is a very interesting country because it varies a lot depending on where you are. And we were working in a very traditional 400-year-old village. And it was also a village that really takes a lot of pride in being traditional. The tea house is traditionally a male space. And when I arrived with the group, I was there were two groups of students, and it just happened the first one had 9 women and 1 man. In the group, and we didn't really realize that we weren't allowed into the tea house, so we just kind of barged in, and and this is a farming village, and we had probably 40 older men just look at us like whoa, 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 and they were very politely escorted us out until they got used to us, and then slowly we kind of struck a compromise where the students and I would have tea outside on the veranda, and I think it's just because it's very much it's the cultural tradition. Whether or not women need permission from their male family members to work and to do other things, I can't say. Istanbul is pretty open. I have been in countries, in fact I've lived in one country where women were not allowed to get a driver's license or to leave the airport or leave the country without being signed out by male members, so I know that it definitely happens. The little tea house was kind of special because it was our second project, and it was actually the men who were in positions of like mayor and community leaders, who were in their 30s, who kind of stood up and said, "This is enough. We want to have a place where the women are cut out of all this important conversation." And so the women were in support of the project, and they were very excited about it, but it was interesting because it was really generated by the next generation or by the current generation, which were the 30-something-year-olds. And some of the older men were like, "Yeah, we know what you're doing, but we don't like it. We want to keep our own tea house," which was fine. They definitely supported us. They didn't oppose it. But I was told by a few older men that they were not really interested in a tea house with women. Now, in Ghana, I think that Victoria, the woman who was talking, I've seen it before in other places that I think she was referring to a brother that got an education and had the mobility to leave. So maybe he left the country for employment or went to the capital city, leaving the women who, basically leaving the women with the family. And so I I haven't done research to find out how often that happens, but I think it has to do with mobility and ability to leave the families. And so I don't think it's that uncommon either.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll call on Vice President Giles to make some summary comments.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And I want to start by thanking for visionary leaders speaking or giving you excerpts from their research, from their experiences in different communities, and presenting some of the data from different communities. So you heard experiences from international communities, particularly in Turkey, Sri Lanka, and Ghana. You heard about Inuit, First Nations, and Métis communities and their experiences, Canadian and US communities, academic and corporate communities, and prison communities. And what you heard are the gaps in almost every aspect. We heard gaps in Millennium Development Goals, wage gaps, hiring gaps, treatment gaps, housework gaps, punishment gaps, trafficking gaps, violence gaps, family expectation gaps, freedom gaps, and mobility gaps. So based on that many gaps, I think it's easy to conclude that gender equality is a fiction. And it is fiction not only in certain parts of the regions or societies or the communities, it is a fiction in almost all societies and regions. So inequality certainly varies by the community or the region or the society, and certainly the progress has been made towards the equality, but the progress has been very slow in some parts of the world and very, very slow in other parts of the world. So there are some suggestions were given. Certainly the girls' education is critical to their empowerment. So certainly emphasis on increased education is critical. Another suggestion was made that we need to use art, film, other creative activities, public discussions of this type to raise the awareness and help reduce the gap. But above all, I think all men and women have to continue to work hard to move from fiction to fact. So when we meet next time, hopefully we would be saying it's more fact than a fiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Debra. And I want to thank again all of you who've come tonight. I often say the people who come make the party, and we really appreciate you being here to share this experience with us. I'd like to invite you to our next visionary conversation, The Food We Eat, on June 13th here in this room, same time, and join our expert panel for a discussion about the safety and supply of the food that we eat from the local and the global perspective. And finally, please join me in thanking our colleagues who gave the presentations.